Welcome to Elysium Theatre Company's third podcast as part of our 50th anniversary tour of the island by Athol Fugard, Kani and Winston Ntshona. Recorded with Durham University, we'll be looking at the island's position in South African theatre and history, its role in resistance to apartheid, and its influence on world theatre in general. I'm Jake Murray, Director of the Production and Artistic Director of Elysium. With me is Dr. Rachel Johnson, Historian of South Africa at Durham University. Hello, Rachel. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what your background is in history and at Durham University.
Hi, so I'm a historian. I'm based at the department in the University of Durham. Been here for about 8 years or so now. And my research and my teaching primarily focuses on South Africa and South African history. So that's what I do.
And where does your interest in South African history, your focus on it, come from?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of an accident, really, in many ways, and certainly wasn't by design. I guess I was, as an undergraduate, I had a kind of very inspirational undergraduate historian. I had a very inspirational kind of South African history historian who taught me, and he was the one that encouraged me to carry on and keep going and kind of pursue this as a kind of career in the end. So, and you know, South Africa is a fascinating place. Once you start to get interested, it kind of sucks you in. And I always say that I think it's probably, if you want to understand the 20th century, it's about the most important place you could study in terms of trying to understand what happens in the 20th century in the world. South Africa is pretty important.
Absolutely. When growing up, the first 2 decades of my life were very much in the UK. I'm very aware of the whole process of apartheid and what was going on. And it's fascinating to think, and we tend not to think of anybody in the Western world as being totalitarian, and for the white community it was supposedly a democracy. For the black community it really wasn't. But it's easy to forget that for most of the period after the Second World War, most of the world was either under empire, kind of totalitarian regime, whether it was the Soviet Union or Maoist China. And I think what's always interested me about South Africa is, in one sense, it was the quintessence of the legacy of empire and colonialism. And the racial politics that we're still trying to deal with today. And I think that's why these conversations are so important, because to understand it, as you say, illuminates where we are now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, people often talk about South Africa as a kind of exception, or there's a kind of certain sense of exceptionalism about its history, but it's so interconnected with much broader trends and kind of processes that went on in the 20th century. I mean, it's peculiar in lots of ways, but it is also very much kind of still embedded in those wider trends. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what apartheid was? Because there are a lot of people now, generations, who don't know anything about it, and then perhaps a little bit about how it arose.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so apartheid literally means apartness. So as a word in Afrikaans, it literally means apartness. And its beginnings, it's really a kind of, initially it's really an election slogan that nobody really has much sense of what the content of it is actually going to mean in practice. And the context in which it becomes an election slogan for a particular political party, the National Party, in South Africa, there's a kind of long backstory to that, if you like. So already in the 1940s, when this becomes a kind of a political slogan, South Africa is a segregated society. Okay, so there are kind of racial segregation is built into aspects of daily life and kind of the way the economy works and all the rest of it. So apartheid didn't sort of is not the origin of kind of segregationist laws in South Africa. They pre-existed the apartheid state. In 1948, this National Party comes to power on the back of this slogan that they're going to enforce apartheid in the country. And it's partly as a result of the fact that the kind of segregationist laws are becoming increasingly unworkable in many ways within the country. And so there were kind of arguments about whether they should be either abolished, or the kind of alternative argument was that they should be more strictly enforced. And that's where the kind of that comes from in that sense.
And this election was just after South Africa become independent from the British Empire, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, so South Africa is a bit of it's a slightly odd thing to describe in many ways. So South Africa as a country, as a kind of nation state, if you like, comes into being in 1910, and it emerges after the South African War. So after the war between the British Empire and settlers of Dutch origin, the so-called Afrikaners in the region, and it's a kind of coming together of several different kind of polities in the region. So the Union of South Africa in 1910 is the kind of beginnings of a kind of semi-independent nation state called South Africa. It's still connected to the British Empire at that point, but it has some kind of this idea of self-government embedded at that point. And so South Africans, white South Africans, can elect their own government at that point. And from that point onwards, there's a kind of South African politics, if you like, which takes charge of the direction of the country. And in 1948, that state is taken over by the National Party, and by a kind of, the National Party are a kind of Afrikaner nationalist party. So the idea of a collective identity of being Afrikaner is something which has a kind of, again, has quite a long history and emerges out of that that interrelationship between British settlers and those coming from Holland, a process which had begun back in the 1650s. So you kind of get over a long period of time, you get the emergence of this idea of a separate identity of people thinking of themselves as Afrikaners and kind of speaking an Afrikaans language, and believing that they are a kind of nation in and of themselves. And one which had a kind of antagonistic relationship with the British Empire.
And did the National Party that won in 1948, did that pretty much win uncontestedly throughout the process of apartheid?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a relatively narrow victory for the National Party in 1948, but their kind of their share of the electorate, their share within the elections after that point. So they were in power for another 40 years, and apartheid is some kind of set of policies, if you like, that develops over that period of time. It evolves over time. It doesn't arrive fully formed. Exactly how it kind of plays out and the different kind of emphasis that it takes over time evolves from 1948 onwards. They are re-elected, every year after that. It's really only in the 1980s that you begin to see their vote share kind of falling when things are much more strained within the country itself, and the kind of grip on power, if you like, starts to erode.
And throughout that period, the black population were completely denied the vote.
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of the electoral system from the very beginnings gave votes to white South Africans. There was a kind of anomaly in kind of one part of the country where for a brief period of time in the early 20th century, Africans with certain amounts of property can vote in kind of, but those rights are very gradually taken away, and by 1948 they've disappeared altogether. So the only people who can vote to elect the government are white South Africans.
And how did apartheid differ from other forms of sort of colonial segregation? What was the kind of image I have of apartheid was that it was even more extreme than most previous forms of colonialism or imperialism. Can you say a little bit more about what the experience of black people was under apartheid and how segregation was enforced and how it worked, to what extent?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so if you like, the kind of basis of the system was that every person was classified as a particular race under the apartheid system. So you were either white, African, coloured, so of mixed parentage, or Indian. And what race or classification you were given dictated all aspects of your life, in the sense of where you could live, what jobs you could do, what rights you had under the law. So from that premise, the kind of movement of people was highly regulated by the so-called pass laws. So if you were African, you had to carry at all times a pass, which kind of dictated where you could work, where you could live, all those kind of things. And being caught without a passbook was an offence that many people were arrested for on a kind of daily basis in lots of ways. So in terms of the kind of difference between apartheid and other forms of segregation, it's often the kind of, if you like, it's often the scale of what the apartheid state attempted to do in terms of kind of reorganizing the space of South Africa around racial groupings. So in terms of literally kind of removing whole communities and putting them in a different geographical space because they were in the wrong place. Apartheid aimed to have a kind of the urban kind of environment was aimed to be a kind of white space, which other groups would kind of serve and help keep afloat, but were not permanent members of the population in urban areas. So they attempted to kind of create white cities and create white spaces, whites only spaces, by literally kind of removing hundreds of thousands of people and moving them to different parts of the country. So in terms of the scale of that type of social engineering, it's kind of peculiar in terms of what it attempted to do under that banner of kind of apartness, keeping people apart.
So the cities, the industry, the money, the media, the culture, and the power, they were essentially, as you say, white spaces.
Yeah, I mean, if there were kind of limited rights for Africans to remain in cities, if you were born in an urban area, you had certain rights to remain, but you were always a kind of, as it were, perceived as a temporary sojourner in the city. You were not regarded as a kind of permanent resident. You didn't have kinds of residential rights and kind of own property and that kind of stuff. So it's a story in which kind of South Africa, the National Party attempted to create a kind of state of South Africa under which the only people who would be kind of given South African citizenship were white South Africans. And so this kind of idea of kind of grand apartheid really takes form by the 1970s. Different ethnic groups are being kind of subdivided up and said, you belong to this homeland, and they kind of give nominal independence to certain kind of areas of the country, the so-called bounty stands or homelands, and everyone who wasn't white was given a kind of homeland as their nationality. And these, this was a kind of very much a pseudo-independence. None of those places ever had a kind of viable possibility of really being independent nation states. So that was the kind of culmination of attempting to create South Africa as a white space and a white nation.
And along with the Bantustans, the townships, can you talk a little bit about the townships and how those worked?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, so most urban areas, despite attempting to kind of make these spaces white, they required the labour of Black South Africans to keep them running, to keep them going, to be serviced. But the apartheid state did not want Black South Africans living next door to white South Africans. So the townships often kind of at some distance from major urban centres. So the most famous township in South Africa is obviously Soweto, which is, a geographical kind of, not very good at known kilometres, but it's about a half-hour drive away from Johannesburg. But most of the people living there would travel into work in Johannesburg in some form or another. So the townships were kind of created at a distance from white urban centres, and the idea was that they would, in a sense, they grow up to service those white areas and the mining industry in particular.
So what was the ideological justification for what the regime was doing? How did they argue it on the world stage? Because obviously, as the decades went by, there was growing criticism and hostility to the South African regime from all over the world. How did they defend themselves? How did they justify what they were doing?
Yeah, so it does change over time. The justifications that kind of get made do change over time, but the kind of central idea was that this was not discriminatory, because it was really just attempting to kind of preserve the culture and the separate identities of groups, right? And the idea, the justification, the apartheid state was often that they were attempting to preserve African cultures by keeping people within their ethnic groups, or by keeping people in certain spaces. They didn't, the white race, as far as the apartheid ideologues were concerned, was the kind of superior race and had a kind of paternalistic job to look after Black South Africans. So there's that paternalism which comes through, and then also, famously in the 70s, people, South African politicians referred to apartheid as really just a policy of good neighborliness, as the kind of the line that gets trotted out. So it's this idea that it's not discrimination. It's kind of it's a way of keeping people separate, and that's a good thing, and that's about preserving identities and about preserving the kind of cultures. I mean, that is obviously kind of demonstrably a kind of set of rhetorics on so many levels, but that was the kind of attempted justification, but also wrapped up in that, white South Africa kind of conceives of itself as defending its nation against a communist threat. And as we know, in the kind of second half of the 20th century, in the context of the Cold War, that was a big part of the justification on the international stage, that they were a bulwark against communism taking over. Southern Africa and its important economies.
Yes, that's something that's very interesting because so I've done, this is actually the fourth South African play that I've done, the fifth, if you count the monologue, The Moth, that I did online during COVID. And the first play that I did was a play called The Dead Weight by Paul Hertzberg, who was the interviewee on another of these podcasts. And it was a phrase that was used in that was to do with the Angolan War, the legacy of the Angolan War, and the end of apartheid and the transition into black majority rule. And there was a reference in that, or a phrase in that the kind of antagonist, an Afrikaner commanding officer, used a total onslaught from Cairo to, I can't remember what the phrase was, this belief that because the communists were essentially threatening South Africa. And we forget again, because of these different narratives, that throughout the whole post-war period, the liberation process in Africa was almost always supported by the communist world. The USSR, Cuba, Poland, other countries behind the Iron Curtain were on the side of the independence movements, and it's very fascinating to, and that's the legacy of that we've seen recently in to do with the reaction of different African states to the war in Ukraine. And it's fascinating, again, as you say, about the whole legacy of colonialism. It's fascinating to learn that the Attlee government felt it was important to give independence to India and Pakistan and Burma and Nepal, but decided to hold on to the holdings in Africa because of the Cold War. And while we see ourselves as being on the right side of history in terms of the Cold War in the USSR, in Africa we were not. We were very much in charge of a different kind of oppressive kind of regime.
Yeah, well, the upholding of white supremacy, in the southern.
And what you're describing, that paternalism, is not different to the white man's burden theory, and the justification for the British Empire was that it was civilizing the world, and that it was only looking after these countries until they could be independent. So it is a fascinating. That's why it's fascinating to look at South Africa as an evolution of an idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how the Black community organised against apartheid.
Yeah, so I mean, the liberation struggle, the so-called liberation struggle, and the kind of attempt to overturn apartheid and to gain full political rights for all South Africans is as kind of as old as South Africa itself. So the most famous liberation organisation, the African National Congress, was founded right back in 1912 at the very beginnings of the Union of South Africa. But yes, after 1948, the liberation struggle has to take on and takes on this new challenge of the apartheid state, and it evolves alongside and it's kind of in opposition to the apartheid state as it evolves over those next 40 years. There were kind of really important kind of significant dates along the way that kind of punctuate moments of change. A big one is 1960, when there's a kind of, at that point, the liberation organizations, the African National Congress and another organization called the Pan-African Congress, have been increasingly kind of mobilizing on a much more mass scale, trying to get people to defy the pass laws. So kind of civil disobedience campaigns. To go to police stations and kind of burn their passes, or to show up at police stations without their passes and say, "You must arrest me," and kind of this idea of flooding the jails and making these laws unworkable. And a kind of a past demonstration in March 1960 is fired upon by police, and a large number of people are killed. And this is known as the Sharpeville Massacre, and is a huge kind of punctuating moment in kind of and shaping what happens in the liberation struggle over the next 20, 30 years or so, because in the aftermath of the Sharpeville Massacre, the liberation organizations, the ANC, the Pan-African Congress, and various other ones are banned by the apartheid state. So they become illegal organizations. It becomes illegal to be a member of them. They can no longer organize a kind of above ground. They are illegal organizations and they have to go underground. There had already been kind of conversations going on for some time within those organizations over whether non-violent opposition to the apartheid state was going to be enough to overturn it. And there were those arguing that already in the kind of late 1950s that it wasn't enough. But after the Sharpeville massacre and those kind of this change in kind of the legal status of the organisation, there begins to be a kind of much stronger concerted move towards that. And the ANC and the PAC both found kind of armed wings, if you like, and there is an armed struggle launched against the state at the same time as a kind of above ground political struggle. So that evolves again. Large numbers of people have to go into exile from 1960 onwards. Large numbers of people are arrested. There are kind of these big show trials towards the end of the 1950s and the 1960s in which large numbers of anti-apartheid activists are imprisoned, tried for crimes, for treason, various other, and sabotage, and arrested and sent to prison for long sentences. Obviously Nelson Mandela being the most famous prisoner amongst those, but there are many other men and women who were also sent to jail at that point in time. Yeah, and I guess that's in a way this then is the backdrop for the play, the island itself, thinking about the place of those who've been sentenced for their opposition to the apartheid state.
Well, that brings us perfectly to the play Robben Island, and everything you're talking about segues with the play. Obviously, the play was written sometime after that key event of Sharpeville and Mandela's arrest. But as we find in the play, the two activists have been arrested for burning their passes. One of them's been given life, the other one's been given a 10-year sentence, and they're sharing a cell on Robben Island where Mandela was held. Can you tell us a bit about Robben Island?
Yeah, so Robben Island is an island off the coast of Cape Town that has a kind of long history in relation to the mainland. It's kind of used for various things. A prison for a long time, a quarry, a leper colony. But in 1961, it gets taken over by the apartheid state and starts beginning to be used as a prison. And from 1962, they send it's sent as the kind of maximum security prison for political prisoners. Although the apartheid state always denies that it has political prisoners, it says these people are risks to security. They're not political prisoners. They are security risks. Anyway, it's where those who are kind of tried for crimes, including sabotage and treason, are sent. It's a prison for black men, so anyone who's kind of classified African, coloured, Indian under those racial classifications, and only men are sent to Robben Island. So there are no white prisoners there, and there are no women prisoners there. Initially, in those kind of the early 1960s, conditions on the island are, by all accounts, really quite appalling in lots and lots of ways. There is a kind of population of criminal prisoners that the stories goes are often being used to kind of very violent kind of gangs who are kind of also being used by the prison warders against political prisoners in lots of ways. In that initial period, the conditions in terms of food and kind of access to anything are really quite appalling. It's referred to the kind of description that often gets used is Robben Island hellhole. So it's referred to as a really brutal and kind of brutalizing place. And gradually over time, thanks really to kind of prisoner resistance against that regime, they are able to kind of to claw back some improvement in conditions. By the kind of 1970s, people were referring to it not just as a kind of a brutal place, but also it's referred to as the university, in part because of the levels of kind of political education that actually go on there. I mean, it's the kind of strange thing that often happens with kind of repressive regimes when they imprison those who are fighting against them and then hold them all together. They actually kind of create spaces in which people who are unable to communicate and unable to have kind of free and above ground conversations could suddenly be brought together to talk to each other. And they were obviously cut off from the rest of the mainland, but in that space they are actually able to kind of forge a kind of even more sophisticated levels of political understanding and strategies. Actually, the argument goes that there are certain strategies of resistance which play out on Robben Island, which actually come once those prisoners are released back into the community, that actually get taken back into the liberation struggle as well. So Robben Island is a really kind of it's a very particular prison. It has the kind of largest concentration of political prisoners over the longest period of time. There are other prisons in South Africa on the mainland that hold political prisoners as well, but this is the kind of biggest concentration over the longest period of time of kind of political prisoners being held. at some point, so I think at its kind of height in the late 1960s of the numbers of people being held there were well over 1,000 prisoners, but by the late 1980s there's only around 200, so it kind of fluctuates. The numbers fluctuate over time. Yeah, and it's a kind of, there's this a historian called Fran Buntman has written, if anyone's interested in kind of finding out more about the story of Robben Island in particular, has written an extraordinary book which kind of details, based on oral history interviews with former prisoners, this kind of evolution of the kinds of resistance that they try to organize against the prison regime, and how they're able to gain kind of certain rights to, or gain back kind of improved quality of food, and then also once they've kind of taken care of those more basic human needs, to get study privileges, to kind of be able to actually kind of use that time productively, and to organize kind of themselves when they're in the prison, and as a way of kind of regaining their sense of self in that kind of environment. Yeah,
that's very much what the play is about. That was a fantastic exposition on the island and the prison. So tell us, what do you think, or what did bring apartheid down finally?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, in a big question like that, there are obviously multiple factors going on. But by the time you get to the 1980s, despite the kind of repressive regime that exists and the kind of the ways in which any kind of new organizations that crop up, the state, attempts to outlaw them, attempts to kind of decapitate them in terms of their leadership and imprisoned leaderships. Despite that, the kind of sheer volume of people involved in kind of attempting to oppose the state on all kinds of levels by the 1980s, it's reached the point where the state has kind of lost control over large parts of the country. The ANC from exile was calling for people to make the townships ungovernable. This was the kind of idea from the mid 1980s onwards, that the state should be kind of resisted at all levels. And the state had to declare states of emergency, was using the army to kind of keep control of these places to any degree. And those things takes its toll, right, in all aspects of life. So there is this huge challenge coming internally. At the same time, you've got the shifting kind of geopolitics going on outside as well. And there are, people mobilized across the globe in the anti-apartheid movement, putting pressure on those governments which were continuing to support the apartheid state, particularly the US government and the British government, who had up until that point been providing kind of support. Movements to attempt to kind of bring sanctions against the regime, to attempt to kind of discredit it, and to kind of force those governments to take action against kind of attempting to persuade the apartheid state to either reform or to kind of to change its ways. And of course, the broader context of the Cold War shifts towards the end of the 1980s as well. So the kind of fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. Some people argue that that's the kind of necessary, if you like, precondition for the apartheid state attempt agreeing to negotiate with those opposition groups. So I mean, the apartheid ends in a very sort of complicated and messy way, because it's not overthrown by this liberation movement. The National Party agrees to, or kind of takes a move to, release political prisoners and unban the organizations, and to enter into a series of negotiations in 1990. And so between 1990 and 1994, there's this process often referred to as the transition to democracy, which involves the National Party and those organizations who had been, campaigning against it and organizing against it for so many years, actually sit down and talk to each other and try to figure out how to move forward, and end up writing a kind of interim constitution, and then eventually a final constitution, which removes all aspects of that kind of apartheid in terms of law, from the way that the country functions, and moves to a system of one person, one vote. There is democracy is established at that point, but that comes out of a kind of negotiated end to apartheid, which has certain effects on the ways in which the post-apartheid state kind of moves forward, and how it deals with those legacies, which undoubtedly are still there and still being grappled with today.
That's a whole subject for an entirely podcast. because the passing into true democracy and freedom was a massive thing in 1994. I remember the world finding it extraordinary, but apartheid has cast a very long shadow, and I think a lot still to be dealt with. So the last thing I will say, it's been an absolutely fantastic interview, is now 2023, what can we learn from the lessons of apartheid?
I mean, there's an awful lot to learn from studying how the apartheid state comes about and then how it's eventually, overcome on one level. There's an awful lot to learn in terms of the lengths to which people will go to uphold systems and the lengths to which people are forced to go in order to attempt to bring them to an end. I think also, the complicity of of our own country that we're sitting in today and other parts of the world in kind of upholding those systems is a really important part of the story, that we can think about what forms of complicity are being involved today and what other regimes are being upheld for different kinds of reasons.
Well, we talked a lot in rehearsals about how, with the whole discourse on race that's going on at the moment globally, apartheid seems to have been left out, or it's not talked about as vividly as something like slavery and wider kind of issues of colonialism and empire. And we wondered if that was because apartheid is seen as a more European thing because its roots are in Dutch and British kind of history, and the discourse at the moment is very American influenced. And certainly for me, apartheid is almost like a paradigm for how appalling racial politics can become, which is why I think these plays by Fugard are so important now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, listen, Rachel, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Your knowledge about the subject is breathtaking when you talk about it with a real passion, and I've learned a huge amount, and I'm sure our listeners will too. I'd like to say a massive thank you.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot.
For more details of Elysium Theatre Company's 50th anniversary tour of the island, see the context box below. Thank you.